The smoke in the GRU briefing room hangs so thick, it almost feels like part of the furniture. Maps of Western Europe cover the walls, big red arrows confidently stabbing toward the Rhine as if the war is already won. A long wooden table groans under the weight of ashtrays, coffee mugs, and men who believe nothing on earth can challenge their T-72. Someone closes the door, the projector flickers to life, and a grainy schematic fills the screen. For a moment, no one reacts. Then the colonel, with a face carved out of diesel fumes, taps the drawing with his pointer. "Comrades," he says, "the Americans are putting an aircraft engine into a tank." A low chuckle rolls from the back row, then another. Within seconds, the entire room is laughing. Real, belly-deep laughter, the kind you hear when a joke hits too close to stupid to be believed. A general in the front takes a slow drag on a cigarette and exhales a cloud so blue it could be a flag. "An aircraft engine? What do they plan to do?" he murmurs. "Fly over the Fulda Gap?" More laughter. Someone coughs out, "That pig will sink in the first muddy field it touches," and the room nods in smug agreement. The projector hums on, ignored. The XM1 file lies on the table like an inconvenient piece of paperwork no one wants to read. In their minds, the case is closed. The T-72 is the fist of the motherland. The Americans are building a diva that drinks fuel and cries for maintenance crews. None of them know it yet, but the joke they're telling, loud, confident, and wrapped in cigarette smoke, is the same one that will come back 13 years later and choke the room into silence. Out in the training fields of the Soviet Union, the T-72 didn't just sit in the mud, it belonged there like a wolf in its natural habitat. Watching it move, you could almost hear the quiet pride of the engineers who built it. Small, low, mean-looking, the kind of machine that didn't waste a single centimeter on anything that wasn't violence. If the old T-34 was the hero of the Great Patriotic War, then the T-72 was its sharper, colder grandson, raised not on glory, but on spreadsheets calculating how to win World War III by Tuesday morning. From the Soviet point of view, this wasn't arrogant. It was math. You didn't win a European war by having the prettiest tank. You won it by having thousands of them, rolling forward like a steel tide. No NATO map could stop. The planners at the General Staff could close their eyes and already picture it. Waves of T-72s punching through the Fulda Gap, dust rising behind them, West Germany folding like a cheap lawn chair. And why wouldn't they think that? They'd been comparing specs for years. Leopard 1, too thin. Chieftain, too slow. M60, too old. One by one, the Western tanks looked like museum pieces being lined up for execution. The T-72, on the other hand, was built for the army they actually had. 18-year-old conscripts who could break a wrench just by looking at it. So the designers made the tank simple, almost suspiciously simple. The autoloader meant you didn't need a fourth crewman. The silhouette was so low you could practically lose it behind a bush. And if something broke, well, hand a soldier a hammer, a swear word, and 15 minutes. Problem solved. This was the heart of the Soviet belief. Why build one complicated machine that required a doctorate to operate when you could build 5 T-72s and teach a farm kid to drive them by lunch? Quantity had a quality all its own, after all. And sitting in Moscow watching their steel army grow by the hundreds every month, it genuinely felt like they had cracked the code of modern warfare. Nothing in their worldview suggested they were wrong. Nothing hinted they were marching toward the biggest miscalculation of their era. They didn't lack information. That's the part people forget. GRU officers, KGB analysts, whole desks full of men whose job was to peel apart every Western secret like onions. They had the data on the XM1. What they didn't have was the lens to understand it. So the reports piled up, stamped, categorized, and, unfortunately, interpreted exactly the way everyone already expected. The first big conclusion came early, and it felt so obvious that nobody bothered to question it. The Abrams, according to every fuel log and every engineer they interrogated, drank more kerosene than a nervous pilot on takeoff. Perfect. That meant the Americans had built a tank with a built-in leash. In any real war, they decided, the Abrams would stop not because of enemy fire, but because its fuel trucks would die from exhaustion trying to keep up. One colonel joked that the XM-1 would be the first tank in history defeated by its own thirst. The room laughed. The report was filed. Check. The second finding sounded even more reassuring. The Abrams was stuffed with electronics, chips, sensors, computers, optics, and to Soviet analysts, this looked like a glass chandelier waiting for artillery to walk by. A single near miss, they argued, would shake those delicate circuits into a fine American powder. Meanwhile, Comrade Tanker Ivan could slam his T-72 into a ditch, crawl out, hit the optic with his boot, and drive off like nothing happened. This wasn't just comforting. It matched decades of Soviet battlefield experience. So, once again, check. Then came the third conclusion, the one they embraced with almost religious certainty. The Americans, they wrote, simply didn't understand tank warfare. They had built a defensive machine, too heavy to maneuver, too complex to maintain, too precious to risk. A tank destroyer pretending to be a main battle tank. The Soviet officers took this as proof that their own doctrine was superior, that the West was forever trapped playing catch-up. The Abrams, in their minds, was a prop for Pentagon briefings, not a weapon meant to survive the apocalypse. And these three ideas, fuel, fragility, failed doctrine, didn't stay in a drawer. They became training material. They shaped simulations, manuals, lectures, and ultimately the confidence of an entire armored force. No one realized they were building their certainty on sand. Because while they were busy proving the Abrams couldn't possibly work, they never stopped to ask the one question that mattered. What if the Americans weren't trying to build a better version of their tank? What if they were building something entirely different? Out on the proving grounds, the Abrams didn't look like a tank so much as something the future accidentally dropped into the 1970s. If the T-72 was a clenched fist, the Abrams felt like a locked vault, thick, heavy, and built with the quiet confidence of someone who knows a punch isn't getting through. The armor alone was a mystery wrapped in steel and ceramic, the kind of thing that made Soviet analysts scratch their heads and mutter, "This can't work," which usually means it works a little too well. Every time a shell slammed into those layers, it didn't politely poke a hole. It shattered, smeared, and died on the outside. Inside, the crew barely felt the tap. That was the first clue the Americans were thinking differently. They weren't building a fast coffin with tracks. They were building a machine meant to keep its people alive, because trained crews were expensive, and funerals, even patriotic ones, don't win wars. So they wrapped the crew in a fortress, and then asked themselves, what if this fortress could also sprint like an Olympic athlete? Enter the turbine engine. The same thing that got the Soviets laughing in the first place. At idle, it purred so quietly that crews joked it sounded like the tank was meditating. Then the driver tapped the throttle, and the whole 60-ton machine lunged forward so hard you'd think it was late for work. Shoot and scoot wasn't a tactic, it was a lifestyle. Yes, it guzzled fuel like a hungover sailor, but the Americans had decided mobility and acceleration were worth every drop. When the engine could pull a tank back behind cover before an enemy round even finished saying hello, it was hard to argue. And then came the electronics, the part the Soviets were absolutely sure would explode if you sneezed near it. Instead, it turned the Abrams into something closer to a mechanical predator. Thermal imaging didn't care about fog, smoke, or night. It saw heat, pure and simple, turning enemy tanks into glowing ghosts on a black canvas. While the gunner lined up one target, the commander was already scanning for the next, swiveling his independent viewer like an impatient bird of prey. The moment he spotted something, the turret snapped toward it as if the tank had a mind of its own. And when the trigger was pulled, the ballistic computer did the math. Every variable, every correction, every angle, before the human brain even finished blinking. First shot, first hit, again and again, like a rhythm the Soviets never imagined a tank could keep. Piece by piece, the picture becomes clear. The Abrams wasn't just a tank. It was a system. Sensors, armor, crew, engine, all fused into one lethal organism. The Soviets weren't laughing at a bad design. They were laughing at a language of warfare they hadn't learned yet. If you zoom out from the steel and the smoke for a moment, the real story isn't just two tanks. It's two completely different ideas of how the world works. On one side, you have the Soviet Union, the grand master of copy, improve, multiply. Find what the West is doing, strip it down, rebuild it in a simpler, harsher form, then churn it out by the tens of thousands. The T-72 is that philosophy on tracks, a blind fist swinging hard and often, trusting that if you throw enough punches, something important will break. On the other side, you have the United States, where nothing is simple, everyone argues, and every new weapons program looks like a small financial crime until it suddenly wins a war. Out of that chaos came the Abrams. Not a neat Soviet-style upgrade of the previous tank, but a messy Frankenstein of ideas. Composites, microchips, thermal imagers that somehow stitch together into a single creature. Where the T-72 closes its eyes and runs forward, the Abrams stops, looks around, and decides who dies first. The Soviets tried to understand that, but they kept looking for the shortcut. Could they copy the armor? Maybe. Could they bolt on more reactive plates? Definitely. But thermal sights, hunter-killer systems, reliable electronics, those didn't come from one brilliant spy photo. They came from an entire industrial ecosystem. Companies that knew how to make microchips by the millions, optics labs that did nothing but chase clearer images, software people arguing over how to shave milliseconds off a firing solution. You can steal a blueprint, you can't steal an economy. So by the late 1980s, the matchup looked like this. A T-72 that could hit hard if it got close enough to see you, and an Abrams that could sense you, track you, and kill you before you even realized you were in its world. One was a hammer, the other was a nervous system wrapped in armor. And all of that, the pride, the mass production, the innovation, the chaos, is about to meet in one place, on one stormy night in the Iraqi desert, where theory finally has to answer to reality. The storm comes in like the desert is trying to erase itself. A shamal, thick and howling, grinding sand across metal until it screams. For the Iraqi T-72 crews dug in along 73 Easting, it's a blessing, nature's own smokescreen. Their infrared spotlights bounce uselessly off the wall of dust, turning everything into a glowing brown soup. From inside those tanks, the world simply stops existing past a few dozen meters. They think this makes them safe. They think nothing can move, nothing can see, nothing can shoot in this. But inside an Abrams, the view is completely different. The thermal sight cuts through the storm like someone switched on a secret layer of reality. Out of the darkness appear shapes, bright, rectangular heat signatures lined up across the sand like a row of lanterns waiting to be shot. The gunner just murmurs, almost casually, "Targets." The commander doesn't even bother sounding surprised. This is exactly what they trained for. Laser. A soft ping. The computer does its magic. On the way. The tank kicks backward with a deep guttural boom. Out there in the storm, a T-72 erupts in a blinding flash. Its turret blasted into the air like a champagne cork nobody wanted. Before the first wreck even finishes burning, the commander is already swinging to the next glowing shape. Target destroyed. Next. It becomes a rhythm, efficient, almost eerie in its calm. Laser. Fire. Target destroyed. 9 Abrams, dug in, invisible inside the storm, picking off an entire Iraqi armored battalion that can't even see the direction they're dying from. The T-72 crews panic. They fire into empty sand, blind, death, convinced the Americans must be much closer than they are. Some try to reposition, engines roaring, tracks slipping. But in thermal, every move makes them glow brighter, like they're volunteering. Another flash, another turret in the air, another crew wiped out before the gunner even finishes saying, "On the way." The battle lasts just 23 minutes. When the storm finally thins enough for the Abrams crews to look around, the field is littered with gutted T-72s, whole companies erased with clinical precision. And there, sitting in the dust, all 9 Abrams are still intact. Not limping, not damaged, just waiting for the next order, engines humming like nothing special happened. Somewhere, far away in Moscow, the laughter from 1978 finally runs out of breath. When the dust finally settled over Iraq, the numbers spoke with a coldness no ideology could argue with. More than 2,000 enemy tanks destroyed by Abrams crews. 9 Abrams lost in return. And not a single one, not one, was killed by a T-72. The same machine the Soviets once praised as the fist of their doctrine never even scratched the paint on its American counterpart. If anyone had replayed those statistics in that smoky GRU briefing room from 1978, you could almost imagine the silence hitting harder than any shell. The Soviet belief had always been simple. Mass wins. Build more tanks, push them faster, overwhelm the enemy with steel and courage and momentum. But the Abrams belonged to a new era, one where the battlefield wasn't ruled by numbers, but by information. Not by who fired more, but by who saw first. And in that world, the T-72 wasn't a wolf. It was a blindfolded runner sprinting toward an edge it didn't know existed. The Abrams became something more than a weapon. It became a tombstone. A marker carved in steel over the grave of a doctrine that believed copying was enough, that speed could replace vision, that quantity could outvote quality forever. The Americans hadn't just built a tank, they had built a message. Dominance comes from mastery, not multiplication. If you trace the arc from that laughing room in Moscow to the burning hulks at 73 Easting, the lesson is brutally simple. The Soviets weren't defeated by the Abrams gun, or its armor, or its engine. They were defeated by their certainty. Because when you go to war against someone who can see you long before you see them, you don't just lose the fight, you lose the entire era that made you believe you'd win.